Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, Aquarium audience, wherever you guys are. I'm very excited today to have, and we're going to start a bit early, to have Aubrey DeGray come on. And amongst many things, he's an English author and biomedical gerontologist. He's done just remarkable work in the world of anti-aging, from working on businesses to going on talks. He's probably been on more podcasts than I've seen most of our guests on. And he's done a lot of great work, different foundations, different organizations. Aubrey, I'm not going to steal your thunder for too long. I'm going to pass the mic over to you. If you want to give our audience a quick intro to yourself, and then we can jump into the itinerary of the broadcast.
Thanks so much, Noah. It's great to be here. I see there's a lot of people here, so I'm delighted to be talking here. As you say, I'm originally from the UK. I started out actually as a computer scientist, and I switched careers in my early 30s. So I've been working on the biology of aging for best part of about 25 years now, I guess. About 22 years ago, in 2000, I had, I guess, the breakthrough for which I'm best known in the field, which was to realize that the most practical way in which we might go about bringing aging under comprehensive medical control in the foreseeable future would be not to develop ways to slow it down more and more and more. But rather to develop ways to turn it backwards, to actually rejuvenate people who had already reached a certain biological age. This sounds rather counterintuitive at first hearing, and it was very, very counterintuitive to the gerontology community. But when you think about it as an engineer, this just means basically preventative maintenance. It means, periodically removing the rust from your car so that there's never enough rust to let the doors fall off. That analogy sounds like it's probably oversimplistic, but honestly, it's actually a really rather good analogy. So the goal here is to develop a panel of treatments that will remove the self-inflicted damage that the body does to itself in the course of its normal operation at the molecular and cellular level, and thereby to keep the body in a state where the amount of damage that it's carrying around is within the amounts that it is set up to tolerate. That's going quite well now. It was quite ambitious. In fact, it's definitely still quite ambitious, but it was considered so ambitious as to be unrealistic by most people 20 years ago. But over the past 10 years, that really hasn't been true. It's very much a mainstream concept now. So that's what I work on. Over the past 20 years, I have led a series of non-profit organizations in the US, 501c3s. The reason we have gone the non-profit route is simply because we have been very much doing the tip of the spear type stuff, the stuff that's very early stage and thus really essentially pre-investable. In fact, everything was pre-investable until about 6 or 7 years ago, because the investment community just recognized that this was too far off. But some of the lower hanging fruit within the whole damage repair, rejuvenation portfolio, so to speak, has over the past few years gone far enough that investors have started getting involved in really an exponentially increasing manner. So that's really very heartening indeed. But there are still things that are not yet at that point. So I am still very much leading a nonprofit to make sure that those things catch up, so to speak.
So when you say that the approach is not necessarily to slow it down incrementally, but turn back the clock of time, you said kind of removing the rust off of your body. Does that mean that you don't really want to attack aging in a teenager or prevent aging in a teenager necessarily, but want to approach someone who's like in their 40s or 50s?
That's exactly what I mean, yes. The basic thinking is that every machine, whether it's a living machine or a non-living machine, accumulates damage that, that is just an inevitable consequence of its normal operation. That's just a fact of physics, never mind biology. But every machine is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage, such that the machines function. So in the case of a human being, that means, of course, both physiological and cognitive function. That function is not appreciably impaired until there's a certain amount of damage, like the amount that we might get to in middle age or later. And therefore, yes, if you're a teenager, then it's going to be decades before you get to that point. And you're actually better off waiting, even if the therapy still already exists, to do something about the damage that you're accumulating. By the time you've got enough damage that you're getting close to the amount that matters, the therapies that can remove it will be better than they are today. So even when these therapies exist, which some of them do and some of them don't at this point, that will still be the case, that middle age is the time to address this.
So hypothetically speaking, someone who's middle-aged, if the therapies reach a point where we hope they reach, can essentially remove damage to the point where they look like someone who's 21?
Oh, absolutely. And of course, not just look, but also feel and function. Yeah, that's the exact idea. In fact, the amount of damage that you have in the body could be reduced even to the level that one had as a baby. Of course, that would not change the process of development that made one an adult. So one would still absolutely be an adult in every way, and one would have all the memories and everything that one would normally have at one's chronological age, but the damage could be as gone as you like.
Okay, so I mean, for people listening, some folks might find this incredible, right? This is, if whether or not you consider aging a disease, this is a paradigm shifting, if it comes to fruition, a paradigm shifting moment for humanity, and it's going to change the face that people interface with the world. Why do you think, this is a couple questions here? So why do you think human beings are so fatalistic about the problem of aging? And I know that you've mentioned before that as we get closer to solving it, people become less fatalistic. But what do you say to those who argue that, allowing humans to live life indefinitely disrupts its natural stream, its natural flow?
So let me deal with the second question first, because the second question is really an example of the first question. The first question is a kind of very general one. So people say, oh, it's against nature to disrupt aging. Aging is natural and all that. Well, of course, aging is natural, dear. Tuberculosis is natural, and nobody says we should leave that alone. What's natural is for human beings to do their best to change nature, to actually develop technologies to manipulate nature so as to make life better. And whether better means longer or it simply means healthier or higher quality or whatever, all of that, all of the above. So, what would be unnatural, what is unnatural, is for us to be fatalistic about this one thing and to just leave it alone when we're perfectly happy doing all this other stuff, like inventing, fire and the wheel and, antibiotics and so on. then the general question, why do people, have such a, well, I would say straight up irrational view of this particular topic, and it is insanely irrational. I coined the phrase for this that I tend to use about 20 years ago. I call it the pro-aging trance. Um, and the reason I called it that is because when I started coming across this phenomenon of people actually, bending over backwards in the most extraordinary ways to kind of, make excuses for aging and argue that it was some kind of blessing in disguise, I realized that it's pretty much the way that people who have been hypnotized in a stage hypnosis show, which I happened to see when I was an undergraduate, um, address like incompatibilities in the logical incompatibilities in what they believe to be true. Basically, my view is straightforward, that it is simply a survival mechanism. That historically, when there was no clue how to go about developing medicines against aging, and therefore when there was no real reason to believe that there was any chance of developing such medicines in time for oneself, then one only had the option of finding some way to put it out of one's mind and get on with one's miserably short life and make the best of it, rather than being preoccupied by this terrible, ghastly thing that was going to happen to oneself in the in the distant future. And once that becomes accepted, then of course it doesn't matter how you put it out of your mind, just as long as you succeed. So it's absolutely breathtaking how spectacularly illogical will be the positions of people who are completely logical about absolutely everything else in life. You talk about this to them, and they'll just go completely off the off the reservation.
Yeah, it is interesting, Aubrey. And, I listened to your TED talk back in 2005. You made the comparison of malaria and aging, and you said that, the former arguably, or rather the former arguably kills less people than aging. And we've done gone a long way of tackling that. And you also mentioned fox hunting and how the British government stepped in to do something about it. Why don't governments, it seems to me that one of the biggest reasons we haven't made and we are making strides, but one of the reasons we haven't made as much of a stride or as many strides as we should have towards solving this problem is because bigger governments aren't getting involved and there's not more funding being thrown at it. Why do you think so many governments aren't taking this seriously?
Oh, I think that's an easy question to answer. I mean, governments are always at the trailing edge of changing trends, simply because their number one priority in life, and they don't exactly hide this, is to get re-elected. And therefore, they have no choice but to follow public opinion rather than trying to change it too much. And I've recognized that since the early days of my, becoming reasonably prominent in the wider world. So I have very much focused on trying to change public opinion so that kind of governments are given permission to move forward. Of course, there's certain one that can be done behind the scenes with governments, just educating them and getting them to be in a position to move to respond to public opinion when it does change, and to respond more nimbly than they otherwise might if they'd just been taken by surprise. And certainly there's quite a lot of that going on right now. Some of the work that we're funding at LEV Foundation is precisely that. We have an organization that we help, which is lobbying, and which does a great deal of interfacing with Congress on Capitol Hill. So this definitely happens, but it's a work in progress.
So ideally, we reach a point where human beings, and barring some sort of cataclysmic event, are able to extend their life. And I want to get into the science of it more, but I wanted to first kind of flush out the misconceptions and kind of the arguments against. But let's say that human beings can live forever. Obviously, we can't keep reproducing the way that we currently are. What's that? I want to frame the question this way. How is that going to affect one's tendencies towards like existentialism and hedonism when there is a lack of purpose? A lot of people find purpose in having a family and having kids and building a life. Do you think there will be a shift in what one's purpose is based on the fact that they know they will be living forever?
Yeah, when you're discussing a topic that you're not very familiar with, you should always stop yourself when you find yourself using the word obviously, um, because it's usually not so obvious. The thing is that we could perfectly well continue reproducing the way we are now for quite a while, actually. Because today we have far too many people, that's for sure. But in what way we have far too many people, we know the answer to that. It's not that we don't have enough space. Every single person on the planet could have their own acre at this point. Even if we restrict ourselves to the places that are nice to live. The only problem is pollution, of course. We're burning too much carbon. We're, creating too much greenhouse gases. We're creating too much, plastics that don't degrade and so on. And what do you know? People are developing technologies to fix all of those things. It is absolutely nailed on certainty that way before there is any demographic impact of the work to bring aging under medical control, the problem will be solved. That the amount of environmental impact that humanity has will be going down, even as the size of the population continues to rise. Now, then again, of course, we've also got to say, when we talk about whether we will carry on reproducing as we do today, that is not one thing. We know that there is this thing called the demographic transition, in which whenever a society goes through a point of sufficient female emancipation and education and prosperity, the average number of kids that women have in that society plummets. And as far as I know, just one exception to that in the whole of history, which is Israel. And Israel's a nice small country, so it doesn't make a difference to the points that we're talking about. Um, and so we know that as more and more countries undergo that transition, the population problem, so to speak, will be alleviated. And indeed, quite a few people are talking about the opposite problem of having too few people. The additional thing that people often miss is that when a society goes through this demographic transition of having very many fewer kids, also turns out that your average woman in such societies has a shift in the age at which they have their first kid. They have them a bit later. So we may ask why, and of course, different women have different reasons. But whatever those reasons are, those reasons would apply indefinitely. And of course, the reason they don't apply indefinitely today is because there is a deadline called menopause, which is one of the aspects of aging, and therefore is going to go away. Not that, of course, it would be optional, so one doesn't have to menstruate forever if one doesn't want to. But the point is that one could have kids safely at any age, which means that if one was delaying a little bit, then one could delay a little bit more, and a little bit more. So it may actually be that without any change to any kind of restriction on having kids the way we want to, actually this terrible specter of overpopulation will never actually materialize.
So Aubrey, I wanted to kind of jump into fundamentals, especially ones that you've broken down in the past. First one is the longevity escape velocity. Can you give us a breakdown of that and also explain why there is such a big difference between extending the lifespan of someone who's 50 by 30 years versus someone who is 60 by that same amount?
Well, let's see. There isn't all that much difference between 50 and 60. So I'll come back. I ask you to elaborate on that part of the question when I've answered the first part. But the first part about what is longevity escape velocity, so that's become a slightly more prominent question in the past few months since I chose to use it as the name of my new foundation. But it's a term that I coined a long time ago now. I'm going to say 18 years ago, 19 years ago. And it's actually a very easy thing to explain in the abstract. You don't need biology for it. In order to do so, I have to give a small amount of background. So, as I mentioned earlier, the focus of our work is rejuvenation, repair of the damage of aging, as opposed to slowing down the rate at which that damage is generated in the first place. And if you do that, then of course you end up taking someone who's at a certain biological age, which is, we just define biological age to mean the amount of damage that you have in your body. And we take them back to a younger biological age. Great. But of course, they're still making that damage because they're still alive. And therefore, they continue to come back to the biological age that they were when you treated them. However, of course, you can treat them again. You can treat them as often as you like with these therapies. Now, if you're a car, then you're in luck because we understand cars well enough that we can just do that, the same thing to them forever. And that's why we have cars that are literally 10 times older than they were designed to get to. So, cars that are 100 years old and they were probably designed to last 10 years. But in the human body, we don't understand things that well by any means yet. Therefore, we have a bit of a problem. The initial therapies that we developed that I think we have a 50-50 chance of getting to within the next 15 years or so, those therapies will be imperfect. They will repair a lot of the damage that the body accumulates, inflict upon itself throughout life, but not all. Therefore, we may be able to give somebody, let's say, 20 years of additional life using such methods. And the people that we'll be able to give it to will be people in middle age, as you mentioned earlier, maybe up to 60 or 70 biologically. But once they have been alive for another 20 years, they'll be back where they started. And the problem is that by then, the way in which they will be back where they started is a little bit subtle. They will have the same total amount of damage that they had when they were 20 years younger. But that damage will be predominantly of the form that the therapies don't work on. Because, of course, that damage has been accumulating unabated, which means that on its own, however often we remove let's call it the easy damage, the difficult damage will be enough to get the person to the point where they start to get sick and so on. So in order for us to actually continue this process effectively and re-rejuvenate the same people, we have to have better therapies. We have to have been improving those therapies over those 20 years so that when the person comes back for their re-rejuvenation, they can be given therapies that not only repair the easy damage, but also some proportion of the difficult damage. All right, so I realized this a long time ago, as I mentioned, and I thought to myself, well, okay, what does this actually mean? Is there some kind of threshold here? And I realized there's a very straightforward threshold. Yes, there is a minimum rate at which scientists will need to improve the comprehensiveness of these rejuvenation therapies over time in order that people who are at any time receiving the state-of-the-art therapies, the best that exist, those people will stay one step ahead of the problem, and they will never get biologically any older, even however chronologically old they get. Now, the good news is that the rate at which progress needs to be made actually slows down over time, because the more you chip away at the damage that's difficult, the longer the remaining damage that you still can't fix will take to reach the threshold. So that's wonderful. But it still means that you're going to have to get those first 20 years under your belt. We're going to have to get therapies that are good enough to give people 20 years before we have a realistic shot at keeping one step ahead of the problem. So I gave this name longevity escape velocity to that minimum rate at which scientists need to improve things. And then somebody else came along and coined the word Methuselarity as the moment at which we achieve longevity escape velocity. This is in recognition of the fact that, because it gets easier over the time thereafter, because longevity escape velocity goes down, therefore, it's vanishingly unlikely that once we reach longevity escape velocity, we will ever fall back below it.
And do you think that the number of years required to...
Sorry, no, keep going.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, so do you think that the number of years required to reach, to rather escape velocity, allow us to escape velocity is somewhere between like 25 to 35 years?
At this point, I think that we're probably closer than that. So
well, I meant the number of years needed to or rather, the number of years we need to extend a middle-aged person's life by.
Got it. Yes. So, yes. So now, yes. And so my numbers have become, several of my numbers have become a bit more optimistic over time. 18, 19 years ago, when I first started talking about longevity escape velocity, I said, first of all, I think we have a 50-50 chance of getting to it within 25 years, and now I say only 15 years. But secondly, I used to say back then that we probably needed to extend the life of a middle-aged person by 30 years in order to reach longevity escape velocity, because that's the kind of amount of time that it would take for scientists to improve things fast enough. And I've reduced that number as well. I think that number is more like 20 years, in fact. So in general, that's where we're at. I think it's going to take us, with 50% probability, about 15 years to develop rejuvenation therapies that are sufficiently comprehensive to give us 20 years, and I think that's going to be enough to reach LEV.
Technology, medicine, typically innovations in general, once you have this major breakthrough, seem to have a exponential increase in development and advancement. Is it obvious to you that the study and work and developments of anti-aging is also on that trajectory?
So that trajectory that you describe is very, very true in medicine as well as in the rest of technology. But it kicks off when the major initial breakthrough is made, right? So if you look at powered flight, for example, basically nothing happened until 1903. And then once people saw that it could be done, even in a very clunky way, it took half no time for things to move on really fast. So, literally a decade later, you had airplanes being used in World War I. So, I think that is a general universal truth of technology, that it's an enormously difficult thing to predict how soon a really fundamental breakthrough will occur. But once it does occur, the incremental refinements of that breakthrough to improve performance are always rather rapid and indeed rather smooth in terms of how rapidly they happen.
And using your own terminology, or using terminology that I found researching you, that initial point is referred to as robust human rejuvenation, RHR, and then once you make that breakthrough, then you get at a certain point you get to robust mass rejuvenation. Am I correct?
The last thing you mentioned was robust mouse rejuvenation, yes?
Correct.
So no, you haven't got that part right. But I'll come back to that in a second. So yes, robust human rejuvenation was the the rather clunky term that I originally used to describe what somebody else then called the Methuselarity, the point at which we reach longevity escape velocity. I never talk about robust human rejuvenation anymore, because the Methuselarity is such a nice word. But mice are a different matter. So obviously, mice are used in the laboratory all the time as ways to develop medicines of all kinds, and medicines for aging are no different. So why would I coin something called robust mouse rejuvenation? Well, the answer is because we're never going to get to longevity escape velocity for mice. Why not? Simply because they age too rapidly. We are never going to get that 20 years in mice, or even 5 years, to give us time to get the next 5 years and so on. But we don't need that, because mice are useful in two ways. First of all, if something works in mice, then maybe it'll work in humans, maybe it won't, but it's a lot more likely to work in humans than something that doesn't work in mice. But the other thing is, let's call it rhetorical. This is actually really important, that the more progress we make in postponing the health, the age-related health of mice, the more impossible, the more ridiculous it is to pretend and to claim that aging is just outside of the ambit of medicine, that it's kind of like gravity and inevitable and woven into the fabric of the universe, and like we shouldn't even be trying to fix it, which is still a very ubiquitous point of view that is expressed and espoused by a lot of people.
Aubrey, I wanted to just jump into and let me know if I'm not making a connection right here. But I wanted to jump into CRISPR. If you wanted to give a quick breakdown on CRISPR and why it's so important when it comes to your work and when it comes to solving this issue of aging.
Sure, yeah. So CRISPR, as I guess most people know, is a technology for editing the DNA of cells. And it was developed about a decade ago, and there have been feverish refinements of it over that decade. It's you know, there's a lot of variations on CRISPR now. So why is CRISPR so important? Well, in any technology, tools are just like fantastically important, and in biotechnology, that's especially true. You know, in many cases, a technology will be developed that is equally important across the whole, irrespective of the application that you may end up wanting to use it for. So, for example, 20 odd years ago, when the human genome was sequenced, what did that do? You know, it's just a sequence. But it turns out that having access to that default, that kind of reference genome, allowed biologists across the world to do a whole bunch of experiments much more quickly than they could have done them before, much more quickly and cheaply. So progress was greatly accelerated. Same happened when the Japanese group of Shinya Yamanaka developed this thing called induced pluripotent stem cells, this technique for taking cells, perfectly normal non-stem cells, and essentially winding back their developmental clock so that they became very similar to cells from the early embryo. This is something that made it very, very much easier to do a whole bunch of experiments in regenerative medicine that applied across the board, not only to aging by any means, but certainly aging is included. You know, so that was 15, 16 years ago. And CRISPR is just the same. What CRISPR does is it allows us relatively quickly and cheaply to make changes of the sort that we choose to, desired changes, to the sequence of DNA, just at a local level. Yeah, so we just change the sequence here and there. We don't. It's not a tool for inserting whole new genes, though it is being adapted in that general direction, especially by a method that I thought of several years ago. But the main thing is that it's used to change genes that already exist. And that's vital because, as we all know, there are masses and masses of diseases that are caused by just little changes, like one base pair being different from what it is in everyone else. And suddenly the person is completely sick and they'll die at the age of 5 or whatever. And not only that, this also applies to the health problems of late life. Many people will have heard of the gene apolipoprotein E, which exists in 3 different forms, which for crazy reasons are called numbers 2, 3, and 4 rather than 1, 2, and 3. But it turns out that you really want to have version 2 if you possibly can, and version 3 is pretty good. Version 4 is an absolute disaster, and if you've got version 4 on both of your relevant chromosomes, you are very likely to get both Alzheimer's disease, well, either Alzheimer's disease or atherosclerosis, or both, at a considerably younger age than you otherwise would. So, yeah, we could potentially fix that with CRISPR. This is the kind of thing that CRISPR is for.
And you mentioned that you've been utilizing CRISPR in your own way. Can you unpack that for us a bit?
Well, so yes, so the bench scientists at Sense Research Foundation employ all of the standard techniques of molecular biology and cell biology, and so CRISPR is certainly one of those. But yes, so as I mentioned, CRISPR is it's normally described as something for gene editing, which means that you make a specific change to the genome as it currently exists. And gene therapy in general, historically, has been all about putting new genes into the genome of cells to get the cell to have functions that it normally wouldn't. The difficulty with gene therapy is that the techniques for inserting those genes tend to be unable to control where in the human genome the insertion occurs. And that has really held this whole technology back a lot, because it means that there is a small risk of the gene inserting into a place that does more harm than good. In other words, the disruption of whatever was there already is actually bad. It makes the cell cancerous, for example. So that it doesn't matter that you actually did good by inserting the gene that you engineered. So what we'd like to do is to have the best of both worlds. We'd like to insert DNA, but we'd like to insert it in a very well-controlled location within the genome rather than have the risk of this, what's called random insertion, causing bad things. And so there's a particular type of virus that actually doesn't infect regular cells, it infects bacteria. It's called a bacteriophage. And there are many different types of bacteriophages. One particular type that inserts in a manner that I realized could be controlled in this way. And essentially what one would do is a two-step process where one would use CRISPR to make the cell, shall we say, receptive to such a virus. So essentially insert what I've been calling a landing pad, a place where the virus sees, its natural place to insert. And then one engineers the virus, the bacteriophage, so as to have the gene one wants to insert. And it doesn't insert anywhere else. It has no random integration, as it's called. And so you avoid the potential for cancer and so on.
How far off are we? And I know that countries like China have used this on CRISPR before. Maybe you'd want to elaborate on that. But how far are we from being able to use this on a mass scale on human beings?
So, well, I mean, the first thing I have to emphasize is that I'm a PhD, not an MD, right? So essentially, once things have got as far as getting into the clinical trial sequence, they're kind of outside of my area. And obviously, things do need to go through clinical trials in order to be available to the general public. But the sheer magnitude of the benefits that can be conferred by this kind of technology is well understood. So, people are moving hand over fist to make things go faster. There have already been some tweaks to the regulatory rules at the FDA so as to somewhat streamline things. Certainly that process has not gone far enough. A great deal more streamlining is needed. But one way or another, when things start moving in the right direction, speeding them up is relatively easy. So I would say that these kinds of technologies and their application to the health problems that most people have, which of course means the health problems of late life, we're talking less than a decade.
I want to talk a bit about stem cells. I've read a little bit regarding the potential of stem cells, and I've also read about people going to other countries to get therapies that aren't available here in the US or in Europe. What do you think the reason is that we're lagging behind in the West, or at least in the regions that I named, in being able to utilize stem cell therapy to help people live better lives, painless lives, and potentially regenerate body parts sometime in the near future?
Right. So the issue around stem cells comes down to really two things in the West, one of which applied across the whole of the industrialized world, and the other of which is rather specific to the USA. The one that is general is simply stem cell therapy is tricky. It's complicated. There's a lot that we still don't know about stem cells. We have many different types of stem cell in the body, and if you put the wrong stem cell in the wrong place, it won't do any good. Now, it generally won't do any harm, though there are some exceptions to that, and I'll come to that in a moment. But it's just really, it's a difficult area. It's an area where a great deal more research will improve things. Yet, as you say, we are in a position where, even with the very limited amount that we already know, people can enjoy a certain amount of benefit from certain types of stem cell therapy. Now, the USA specific one relates to a particular type of stem cell, the embryonic stem cell, which is very important in in this kind of research because, first of all, as the name implies, you and I don't have any of these cells. But the thing about them is that they are very, very, very versatile. They, by virtue of being the cells that the very early embryo, 5 days after conception, is made of, they can make absolutely anything. And you don't want to inject cells like that into the body, because if you do, then they won't know what to do. They will basically they will be lacking in context, so to speak, and therefore they tend to do random stuff and create a rather unusual kind of tumor called a teratoma. But that's not what people want to do. What people use these cells for is to expand them up into what's called differentiate them into more specific stem cells that kind of do know what to do, because they are already moving in one particular direction, shall we say. So then the thing is, you still need the embryonic stem cells as a starting point. And 20 years ago, the only way you could get them was by destroying embryos. Now, as I say, the point at which you would do this would be 5 days after conception. And from a biological perspective, almost everybody said, well, okay, this is definitely not a person yet, because, first of all, it's way before the point where an embryo can just split in two and become two people, or two of these like balls of cells can join together and become one person. So clearly there's no person yet. But that wasn't enough, as I'm sure everybody knows, for a lot of people, especially people who took a literal interpretation of scripture. And the result was that this became an absolute hot potato, and federal funding was denied to anybody who wanted to work on these cells. Now, that became pretty much a non-issue just like 15 years ago, when, as I mentioned earlier, this Japanese group developed a method to create cells that were almost identical in their behavior to embryonic stem cells, but which were derived without destroying embryos, rather by essentially turning back the developmental clock on cells that you could extract from an individual. And so now this is kind of not so much of an issue, but of course, the legacy of such things dies hard with, especially with people who don't necessarily spend their life immersed in the science.
So the legacy of it is that, hey, there was this before the Japanese came up with a way to artificially replicate what the embryo does. There was the idea that if you are manipulating or taking the embryo 5 days after conception, you're essentially killing life. And people push back on that. And that you're saying that philosophy, even now, even after we've proven with science that we don't need to do that anymore, it still takes a while for human beings on a mass scale to understand that we can now distance ourselves from that legacy and move forward.
That's right. Yeah, your average non-scientist man in the street is just going to say, "Ooh, stem cells, that's bad." As soon as the word stem cells appears in any sentence, irrespective of the context.
So let's say that in places in the world where this sort of therapy is legal today, what are some of the treatments that you're hearing about? What are some of the miraculous, what are some of the miraculous parts? God, I'm having a hard time speaking. What are some of the miraculous things that you're seeing people heal, whether it's limbs, whether it's regenerating certain cells in the body? I would love to hear more about the practical use cases.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to want to split my answer to this one into a few components. First of all, there are therapies, and these are the ones that get the most attention in terms of clinics in Panama and so on, where stem cells are injected in a manner that sounds really oversimplistic, but appears to have quite reasonably substantial benefits. And here what you do is you just inject stem cells that were taken from somebody else, right? So their DNA is different from the recipient's DNA, from the person who's getting the cells. And just hope for the best, basically. Now, what happens to these cells? Because they've got the wrong DNA, the immune system sees them and destroys them. but not at once. It takes a while. The stem cells are what's called hypoimmunogenic, which means that they are not, the immune system doesn't see them very well. So they hang out for a while before they get destroyed. And that's great because it means that they can do good in the meantime. But what do? What matters in what they do is not that they like divide and become and replace cells that the body is missing or anything. What matters is what they secrete, what they pump out. Just general like feel good, rejuvenating, youthful factors that seem to just like rejuvenate by proxy the cells around them. It's I wish I could be more specific, but nobody can because that's more or less all we know about how this works. It's somewhat magical, as you say. And so that's one side. Then you mentioned tissue engineering, which is basically creating new organs or whatever outside of the body using stem cells. This is a very important area that's been around for decades. And we're making a lot more progress now. A long time ago now, it became possible to create certain types of organ, especially bladders and other urogenitory organs. But those organs have one thing going for them that most organs don't, namely they are flat. They're kind of like, they have a high surface to volume ratio, shall we say. And that makes it much easier to do this because the vascularization, the circulatory system within the organ, doesn't matter very much. In a solid organ like the liver or the heart or whatever, the vasculature matters completely. And that has been the main thing holding tissue engineering back over the years. So now we're getting to a point where we may be largely solving that problem. There are a couple of techniques, one being 3D printing of organs, another being essentially taking an existing organ from, let's say, a pig even, not necessarily even a human, and essentially sticking it in a bunch of rather carefully designed acid that will dissolve the cells but will leave the circulatory the proteins that define the vasculature intact, and then kind of reseeding this scaffold with new cells. So this sounds a little bit weird, but it works, kind of. And we're getting better at both of these things. But really the tissue engineering side of stem cell therapies is still a few years off from prime time. So the last part of what I want to say in answering your question is the thing that excites me the most right now, which is using stem cells the way that people actually think about stem cells. What's a stem cell? It's a cell that divides and creates new cells that can replace cells that the body needs. And of course, in general, when a cell in the body dies, that happens automatically. There's a cell nearby, they'll just divide and you're back where you started, and that's all great. But there are certain parts of the body in which that doesn't happen, such as the brain, almost all parts of the brain anyway. And there's one particular very prominent health problem of late life, namely Parkinson's disease, which is absolutely caused by loss of cells, by cells dying and not being automatically replaced. The cells in question are a particular type of neuron called a dopaminergic neuron, and these neurons sit in one particular part of the brain. They work very hard, these particular types of neuron, and for that reason they die at a much more rapid rate than most neurons do. So by old age, all of us have lost maybe a quarter of the dopaminergic neurons that we had in early adulthood. Now, a quarter is okay. The system is set up with that amount of margin of error. But if you happen to be an unlucky person who loses your dopaminergic neurons a bit more rapidly than most people, then you might end up having lost 3/4 of them by old age, and then you'll have Parkinson's disease. So the logic here is to put new stem cell precursors, dopaminergic precursors, into the right part of the brain so that they will replace these cells. And this was tried in Sweden decades ago, and it almost always didn't work because we didn't know enough. We didn't know anything really about how to manipulate stem cells in the laboratory before injecting them. But when it did work, which was occasionally, it worked spectacularly well. So now that we know so much more about how to manipulate stem cells, people are hot to trot to actually do this for real. And indeed, a clinical trial is already underway in Japan to do exactly this, and there's a couple of other trials starting up in the US.
So, stem cell therapy can not only help regrow certain body parts and rejuvenate certain joints and rejuvenate cells all around the body, potentially preventing people from dying from fatal accidents, but it can also replenish cells in the brain that would offset diseases like Parkinson's. What about Alzheimer's?
Great question. So Alzheimer's disease is a much more complicated and multifaceted disease than Parkinson's. Alzheimer's involves not only the loss of neurons, but also the accumulation of waste products of various types, both inside neurons and outside in the spaces between neurons. And pretty much all of the work that's gone on in Alzheimer's research over the past few decades has been in relation to trying to understand the causality here, to understand, what really happens first, what causes what, how can we preempt the cascade of events. And it's been spectacularly unsuccessful, to be honest. We still have almost no answers to questions about what causes what in Alzheimer's disease. And I think, honestly, we ought to learn a lesson from that. We ought to stop focusing so much on trying to find out causality and just say, well, okay, here's what we see that is different in someone who's getting Alzheimer's or who's got advanced Alzheimer's relative to someone who hasn't. And let's try and just, repair all of that. That's the damage repair paradigm of sense generally, of course, against the whole of aging. And this is the same. So, yeah, at the moment, we are doing okay in moving this forward. Let me talk briefly about the aspects that do not have to do with stem cells before I come back to the stem cell one. To get rid of the waste products that accumulate in Alzheimer's, there's two strategies that I've been focused on. And the reason there's two is because of, as I mentioned, there being two different locations for this waste, one of them inside the cell, one of them outside. Outside the cell, it's not too hard because essentially you can cause the immune system of the brain, cells called microglia, to engulf the material. And once it's inside the microglia, it's automatically destroyed fairly easily. And people have made a fair amount of progress on that. In fact, so much progress that there are now a couple of drugs that are actually approved, antibody drugs that essentially stimulate the microglia to do this. Now, the approval of those drugs was quite controversial because their clinical benefit is pretty much zero. It's very, very slight. And, so should they have been approved at all? I don't know. But the main thing is that we can now do this. We can get rid of this material. And when we do so and we find that there's basically no clinical benefit, what does that tell us? It does not tell us that the material actually has nothing to do with Alzheimer's, nothing to do with the cognitive decline of Alzheimer's. What it tells us is that it's not enough to do that and nothing else. And that's never the plan. The plan is always a divide and conquer one to fix everything, even if it takes multiple therapies to do so. So now, Sense Research Foundation, my previous organization, have a very vibrant new project going on, which I won't go into the gory details of because you can read it on the website, but essentially it's all about using antibodies in a very new way, a very novel technique for getting antibodies inside cells. And we're using a very special type of antibody that doesn't just bind to the thing it's cognate for, its antigen. It actually chops it up. It's a proteolytic antibody. And so we believe that this is the way to address the molecular waste that accumulates inside cells. But now to come back to your original question about the stem cell therapies for Alzheimer's, there's a big difficulty there that does not apply in Parkinson's. And that is that when Alzheimer's gets to the advanced stage where you've got a significant amount of cell death, those cells are distributed across the brain. I mean, some parts of the brain are more affected than others, but it's not the way it is with this tiny little part of the brain called the substantia nigra, which is the only part that matters in Parkinson's. So basically you have to find ways to get stem cells distributed around the brain. And that's very tricky because when you inject stem cells into the circulation, it's easy. They just go everywhere in the bloodstream. But if you do that into the brain, they don't. The brain, the fluid that the brain is basically, that the brain cells are immersed in, or the cerebrospinal fluid, it's viscous, it's sticky. And you inject a bunch of cells in there, they'll just sit where you put them. So we funded a group in New York at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine for a number of years to work on a fantastically clever a way to address this problem, which is to have cells that start out not being neuronal precursor cells at all, but rather behaving as if they were the immune cells I mentioned earlier, called microglia. Microglia actively swim. They actually get their way around the brain in the cerebrospinal fluid, despite the stickiness I just mentioned. So these cells start out thinking that they are microglia, and they swim all over the place. They diffuse around. And then you can just basically flip a switch. You give a simple, harmless drug that does nothing to any other cell in the body, but these engineered cells, you fix them so that that drug tells them to switch their identity and to become neuronal precursor cells after they've done the swimming. Really neat idea. We love it. It's now spun out as a company called Glionics, and they're looking for funding. So anyone who wants to know more should email me.
Got it. So basically the treatment that you're referring to is still in its early stages, and they're still looking for funding. How long, if you had to guess, would it take for something like this to be ready and primed for mass adoption?
Okay, so when something's at that stage where it's got to the point where one can spin it out and one can actually write a pitch deck that actually is worthy of the name, then that means that it's actually pretty close. That's kind of the end of where I'm involved. I get to be involved in things because I do stuff that's before then normally. So here we're talking about something that's 1 year, maximum of 2 years before moving into clinical trials.
Aubrey, I want to be cognizant of your time and
No, don't do that. I've got as long as you like.
Oh, okay, then I have plenty of questions to fill up the broadcast. I wanted to talk a bit about cryonics and
Sure.
What are your thoughts on cryonics? Obviously, a lot of people that are especially older right now in their 70s and 80s aren't going to be able to benefit from the anti-aging treatments and innovations that are coming in the next 10 to 20 years. So a lot of folks are actually freezing their corpses and their brains in liquid nitrogen after their legal death in hopes of restoring them to full health with future technologies. So can we talk about cryonics and whether you think that's even a viable way to kind of bring yourself back to life?
Totally. So I've actually been a vocal and very public supporter of cryonics for 20 years. I believe that it is absolutely tragic and criminal that cryonics is still viewed with such skepticism or even ridicule by the mainstream. The only thing that you just said that's not true is that a lot of people have decided to do this. In fact, the total number of people who are signed up worldwide to any cryonics program is something in the region of 2,000 or 3,000. It's pathetically few, and it's a tragedy. But of course, a large part of why that's true is that the technology is still a long way off. You are absolutely right that irrespective of how soon we actually reach longevity escape velocity, whether we get there in 15 years, as I think we have a 50-50 chance of doing so, or if it takes 50 years or whatever, the point is, whenever we get there, there will be a cohort of people, as you say, who don't quite get there, who nearly but not quite get there. And those people would be very well advised to give themselves a second chance by going into, let's call it, a medically induced coma of an unusual type, because that's all it is, of course. A lot of people start out just not understanding what the point of all of this is, because they think, well, you're dead by then, so when you're dead, you stay dead. And that's something to talk about first, because I guess a lot of the audience here will not really have thought about cryonics very much. It's true that when you're dead, you stay dead. But the question is, when are you dead? At the moment, we don't know. All we know, in fact, we never really can know. So what happens at the moment is that because society likes people to be either alive or dead and not some indeterminate point in between, there's this process where a suitably qualified medical professional declares that you are dead. And from that point, you are. So the question then is, what does that medical professional look for? And really, they just have to convince themselves that you are beyond the reach of current medicine, that there is no way that current medicine can do anything about the state you're in. So, of course, the concept of cryonics is to arrest you at that point, to ensure that the damage that got you that sick does not further accumulate and make you even sicker. And certainly taking you down to liquid nitrogen temperatures absolutely does that. But we are in this rather unfortunate situation right now where we can't just do this. We can't just take even a mouse and cryopreserve it like that and then warm it back up again and let it walk around. And not even a healthy young mouse. Excuse me. So we have to ask ourselves, why can't we do this? And the answer is very straightforward, that when you take a mouse or a human organ or whatever down to liquid nitrogen temperatures, or even halfway to liquid nitrogen temperatures, you introduce a very great deal more additional damage to the tissue than on top of the damage that may have been there already. That damage is caused by crystallization and other issues. Until maybe 25 years ago, it was that the amount of that damage was so humongous that the whole thing was a complete non-starter. The only way that anyone who was cryopreserved back then would ever be revived would be by uploading, by creating some kind of avatar of the person using very sophisticated and high resolution scanning of their brain and figuring out what their personality and memories were and so on. But things got a lot better 25 years ago with the invention of a technology called vitrification, which essentially eliminates the crystallization that happens during freezing. So that you end up with turning the person or the organ into a glass, into an amorphous solid rather than a crystal. There are still some problems though, because the cryoprotectant is not completely non-toxic, and also because fracturing occurs, just thermal stresses occur. But there's new technology that it looks like it might be able to solve both of those problems really comprehensively. And again, this is technology that is at an early stage and needs funding. And we've actually provided seed funding purely philanthropically, even though it's a private company, to this company. It's called Keinice, Keinice. And again, anyone wants more details, I'm very happy to provide them. But I am extremely excited about this technology. I have only provided seed money to a couple of companies, and that's one of them.
So I have a couple questions. One, I certainly misspoke when I said a lot. It seems like quite a few people are taking advantage of this technology, especially with the innovation that you said. It now allows the kind of the organ and the body to turn into glass versus getting so cold where it kills off certain cells. Is this expensive for someone to opt into doing once they're upon their final days?
Right, so no, it isn't. And the reason it isn't is because of society's unscientific view of the nature of death. As far as society is concerned, when somebody declares you dead, you're absolutely dead. And therefore, your life insurance can pay out. And if you get woken up again, then your life insurance doesn't get clawed back. Because that's how the law works. In fact, this has happened. People, of course, not people who were cryopreserved, but people who were declared legally dead. There's quite a few such people walking around quite happily now, and some of those people had their life insurance pay out. So the question comes down to that. The way that almost everybody pays for their cryonics arrangements before they die, obviously, is they take out a life insurance policy. And it's just like any other life insurance policy. The amount that pays out needs to be, depending on exactly what kind of cryopreservation you sign up for, somewhere between $30,000 and a couple of $100,000. But obviously, the fact that it's for this purpose makes no difference to the insurer or anything. So the premium you pay is the same as you would pay if the beneficiary were your next of kin, the way it usually is. In this case, the beneficiary is the cryonics company. And of course, the cryonics company has to do the hard work of actually cryopreserving you immediately before they have received money from the insurer, but they do that.
Okay, so this would only work if the individual who opts into doing it said before, like, hey, I want to do this, or maybe has it in their will. Like, what let's say that you get into a car accident or something, and like, how long after quote unquote legal death, right, a medical professional deems you dead, are you able to use cryonics in someone's body and kind of salvage what's left?
Yeah, great question. So the sooner the better, basically. So the higher end cryonics arrangements involve a thing called standby, which basically says if you're within days of death, you're terminally ill of cancer or whatever, in a hospice, then the cryonics company will actually send a team of experts to your bedside, and they will just hang out, in the coffee room in the hospital or whatever, until you are declared legally dead, and then they will immediately pounce on you and get the job, then start the job. The reason that you have to go as fast as possible is simply that as soon as you become legally dead, obviously your heart has stopped, and so there's no oxygen circulating, and the tissues your tissues are thereby going to be suffering what's called warm ischemia. That means they're going to be decaying much more rapidly than they were when your heart was beating. And the sooner you can stop that from happening, the better. So we have to move as fast as possible. So you're absolutely right. If one dies in a car accident, then one is not in as good a position as if one dies in hospice or in hospital.
So to reiterate for the audience, unlike a lot of the things that we're talking about earlier on this broadcast, cryonics is actually available full-fledged, and correct me if I'm wrong, Aubrey, it's available full-fledged for people to take advantage of today. You just have to go and take the steps in doing so.
That's right. It's just that the quality of cryopreservation that's available today is not nearly sufficient. If someone is cryopreserved today, even if everything goes right, if you know that you're going to die, you're in the cryonics facility when you die, so they do everything to the highest quality available. Nevertheless, the amount of damage that is done to the body, even with this vitrification concept, right, the amount of damage that is done in the process of cryopreservation is still quite substantial, which means that it's very touch and go. I have to honestly say, I think most people, even in the best case, will probably not be coming back. It's absolutely vital that as soon as possible we develop these new technologies that can greatly reduce, further than so far, the amount of damage that's done by the cryopreservation process. I believe that if the technology that Kainos are working on is even half as successful as it seems likely to be, then we'll be there. We'll definitely be there. People will be, the amount of additional damage done over and above the damage that caused the person to be pronounced legally dead in the first place will be relatively rounding error. And therefore, cryonics will be for real at that point.
Got it. So we've made strides, but not quite the final vision yet. You are hopeful, from what it seems. I wanted to ask you, Aubrey, about humans merging with machines and AI. What are your high-level thoughts on that? And then, kind of based on your answers, we can expand upon.
Yeah. So it's funny, really, because on the one hand, I'm a futurist in the sense of, I'm a pioneering technologist, but on the other hand, I'm a little bit old school in a lot of ways. I often feel I've been, like mentally transported here from the 20th century, and I hardly know how to use a cell phone and so on. One thing that I think is perhaps underappreciated is the range of options that we have for making use of technology without merging with it. So, for example, let's just take the internet. 30 years ago, I definitely knew 10 times more phone numbers than I know now. Is that because I'm now getting old? No, of course not. I could perfectly well remember as many phone numbers. The reason is I just don't need to because I've got them at my fingertips. And it's the same with, in general, people are vastly more knowledgeable in, effectively than they were before, even if what's actually in their brains may actually be less knowledge than before. And I think the same kind of thing applies across the board. The better we get at brain-computer interfaces, at getting higher bandwidth between our brains and the outside world, the less important it's going to be to put stuff into our brain, into our skulls. Now, of course, the hardware aspect of a brain-computer interface may involve putting things into one's skull, but that remains to be seen. And I believe that in general, people are always going to be more comfortable with non-invasive approaches. If you've got two options and they basically do the same thing, or even if the non-invasive option is a little less powerful functionally, you're going to prefer that one rather than one that involves surgery.
Yeah, certainly. I know I've always speculated with my friends that it would be cool to live in a world where we could, be partly cyborgs, just because I think about generally speaking, I mean, depending on who you ask, humans are pretty fragile relative to their environment, right? I can't really jump off of a 20-story building and survive, or if I get into a car crash or a plane crash, I'm not, the damage done to my body is quite detrimental. And so I've always figured that, hey, if we could use AI to increase the amount of input from the outs, or rather use technology or AI to increase the amount of input of information and help us learn faster and learn more, and also use robotics to augment our physical state, that would be one way to, well, with respect to the latter, that'd be one way to help us expand, or rather increase our longevity.
Yeah. So, yeah, life-threatening activities and events are obviously things that are going to be higher on people's agenda as they become a higher proportion of the risk of death. If you take away the main risk of death, namely aging, then other things perhaps are thrown into greater focus. Now, some of us mysteriously don't actually have much desire to jump off 20-story buildings in the first place. I've never had any desire to even do a parachute jump. But when it comes to accidents, absolutely, we're well aware, of course, that that car accidents kill more people than every other type of accident combined. But of course, that's one of the main reasons motivating the development of self-driving cars. The whole idea is that self-driving cars would be very much more capable of eliminating such things. And it turns out that they've been quite difficult to develop because it turns out that in order for a car to be coping with all the edge cases that happen on the road, you have to have pretty much the entirety of artificial general intelligence. But we're getting, remarkably close to that now. So I think that we should again be thinking in terms of using AI and AGI mostly as a way to make risky activities less risky, rather than as a way to make us ourselves less vulnerable to those risks.
Yeah, and on that note, Aubrey, give us some insight, if you will, into the use of nanobots going into the body and cleaning out damage, and kind of using robotics to perform surgeries and like trying to repair life-threatening injuries.
So, well, of course, at the macro scale on the robotics question, we are getting very, very much better at this. We've got, surgical techniques now using keyhole surgery and so on that are vastly less invasive than what used to have to be done even 10 years ago. And that progress is very much continuing at a dizzying rate. So yeah, surgery uh, at a like miniaturized but absolutely not nano scale is very much the way to go when it comes to the improvements that we're seeing, so as to allow these things to be much less life-threatening, much less arduous. Nanobots per se, the real like origin of the medical application of molecular manufacturing. I I find it very exciting, and certainly the work that the leaders in this field, like Rob Freitas, have been doing is extremely rigorous and has absolute merit. But what that doesn't answer is whether we're ever going to actually need this, or whether we will achieve essentially everything that can be achieved that way using technology that's much more primitive. And you never quite know until it comes along, right? So I'm always in favor of a multi-pronged approach here, of trying the things that look really difficult, but if they work, they really work. Even while at the same time, you know that there are things that might be much less difficult, it's just they might or might not work. I'm all for addressing both of those things at the same time, rather than, being sequential about it and thereby thereby delaying the time when one actually expects to get to a result. And yeah, so in the case of nanobots, it's the same thing really. In order to have nanobots of the sort that Freitas talks about, you have to have full-blown molecular manufacturing, and that itself is a long way off. But nanoscale technologies, things that would perhaps more accurately be called nanomaterials, which is a term that essentially has hijacked the term nanotechnology over the years. Nanomaterials, absolutely. One of my favorite companies is Nanotics, which is a company that uses nanoscale geometrical fabrication of things in order to do an extremely important thing medically, which is to distinguish between proteins of a particular type that are bound to the surface of a cell versus the same protein that's in the circulation, that's moving freely in the bloodstream. Turns out that the ability to make that distinction has enormous, very wide-ranging medical benefits. And this company has, as a result, been able to develop technologies, and it's in clinical trials right now, all manner of, absolute, blue chip partners like the Cleveland Clinic and the Mayo Clinic and so on. So that's, a really shining example of one little idea that turned out to be massively valuable.
I wanted to, on the note of technologies and innovations that are on the horizon, I wanted to tie it back to therapeutics and ask you, what are some therapies, some anti-aging therapies that are currently available for people to try and that are very close and on the horizon? So two-part question.
Well, let me answer the second part. What's on the horizon? Again, the difficulty in answering any question of that sort is you have to ask, what's on the horizon for in terms of its development, and what's on the horizon in terms of its availability to the wider world.
Availability to the wider world, yeah.
Right. So things that, if we're talking about that, then of course that would have to mean things that are already available to a few. And there's really not much of that. So one of the good things about the development of technology against aging is that it's been a very, very collegial and cooperative community for a long time. It's been one in which a huge number of people, including the investor community, have been very mission focused, very, humanitarian focused, if you like. And so the only real delay between something being available to a few people and something being available to as many people as we can make enough for is generally the regulatory process, the clinical trial process, where obviously in a clinical trial, a few people are the actual subjects in the trial. And so always, if you want to be an early adopter, the way to go is to make yourself aware of clinical trials and to try to get enrolled. So one example of that, here's one that I would say is particularly up there. There's a very, very general approach to addressing cancer, including late-stage cancer, pretty much all cancers, at least 90% of cancers, which was developed by a group in Texas maybe 10 years ago and has now got to the point of a phase 2 clinical trial that's recruiting right now, overseen by a company in Chicago named Maya Therapeutics, MAIA. They're still recruiting. And the reason they are is, well, partly again because the rate at which they can recruit is limited by their own funding. So again, this is an investment opportunity that I'm happy to talk more about. I have been pointing people in the direction of Maya for a while because I have, the reason I'm mentioning the company, of course, is because I have a very, very high opinion of that technology. I think it is possibly, in fact, not possibly, I think it is the single most promising anti-cancer innovation of the past decade.
And you said there's an investment opportunity for those that are equally passionate about it and want to contribute. What are some ways of doing that?
Well, yeah, so all of the companies I've mentioned. So first of all, I should say, I am very much not, an entrepreneur in any way. And I do not invest personally in anything at all. The companies that I try to seed fund, I do that, even though they're companies, I do that philanthropically. So nobody should take my advice when it comes to the likelihood of making money back. My advice is always in relation to the importance and the promise of the technologies in question, and of course the teams, the people who are taking those technologies forward. So all the companies I mentioned, I think I've probably mentioned 4 or 5 today, are ones in which obviously I have personal relations with the founders and the principals of these companies, but I have absolutely no financial interest. No, there's no conflict of interest here or anything like that. I'm just doing what I do. The right way to go forward is simply to email me at aubrey@levf.org, and I will provide as much more information as anyone wants. I can obviously make an introduction. I can provide pitch decks, things like that. I'm the intermediary here, and obviously I'm not telling anyone what decision to make, but I can certainly give my own opinions.
So, Aubrey, expanding upon the previous question, let's say that I'm me. I know I come up to you and I say, "Hey, Aubrey, you've done incredible work in this industry, and you're a super expert. You know everything about everything. Tell me what I can do right now to increase my lifespan, to be healthier. What are some therapies available where I can literally do it? I can fly out. I can do it right now."
Yeah, that's always the most common question, of course. And when I'm in a cowardly mood, I say, listen, I'm just the wrong person for this question because I'm a PhD. I'm not an MD. I can't give clinical advice. I'm not legally even allowed to give clinical advice. But when I'm feeling less cowardly, I go a bit further and I say, right, the problem here is that everything we have today is basically just tinkering around the edges. Even the things that have promising results, like these offshore stem cell therapies, for example, we see that they have some benefits. And, that's wonderful. And it doesn't matter to me that we have so little understanding of how they have these benefits, of the mechanisms. What matters is they work. But the problem is that they don't work very well. They only have very mild benefits, really. They're not going to make you live even a month longer, or certainly not a year longer, unless you're in a particularly bad way. Of course, there are always exceptions where people have something that's particularly badly wrong with them, and they're going to have an unusually short lifespan, and we may be able to substantially mend that. But for someone who's already doing all right, and they're going to live to 80, 85 without any clever stuff, we just don't have stuff that can add more than a year or so to that. So, for me, the most important thing to get people to understand is that in order to help themselves, they need to do what they can to join the movement, to the community, to hasten the defeat of aging. That, of course, means very different things for different people. I'm always looking for wealthy people to donate philanthropically so that I can do the stuff that nobody else is supporting. We also, of course, need wealthy investors to get into the more the things that have moved far enough along to be investable, as I've been talking earlier. But of course, it's not all about money. Scientists, whether young or old, need to be educating themselves to understand what areas of science are the most relevant and which ones, therefore, to go into and to prioritize. Journalists, interviewers, people like you, you got me on this thing, and so as a result, a lot of people are going to know a lot more than they did an hour ago about this whole thing, and I'm delighted about that. So thank you very much for that. And it's very important to understand that everybody who has your kind of opportunity to expose this topic to a new audience should be doing so as much as possible. I spend a humongous amount of my time doing events like this, and the reason I don't have a problem with that is because it's very much part of the job. It's very much part of how to speed up the defeat of aging.
Well, firstly, the pleasure is all ours, and it's been an educational experience for me researching before the broadcast, and it's been an educational experience during the course of the broadcast. I can probably speak for the audience when I say that. And so, yeah, obviously, money matters, and being able to invest money or have people who are passionate about anti-aging, who are philanthropists, throwing their dollars at it is going to help it grow more. It's going to help it progress more. And podiums like this are very important because it gets the word out, and it gets to the ears of people who want to be part of this movement, whether it's a scientist, whether it's a philanthropist, or whether it's just an enthusiast that finds ways to spread the word online through tweeting, through blogs, again, through broadcasts like this one. Eventually, I think we will reach a point where the first therapies do become available. As you've mentioned, you guys have made strides in the last 20 years. One question I have is, when they do become available, is there going to be a strife between the few people who are wealthy and can afford them, and those who cannot?
Yeah, okay, so this is a very, very frequent question. Thank you for asking it. And the answer that I have is one that often strikes especially the American ear as naive or whatever, but I don't think it is. In fact, I'm sure it isn't. There are a lot of reasons. There are three big reasons to know that these therapies will not have any real delay there. In other words, they will become available to everybody who is old enough to need them pretty much immediately that they become available to anybody. So that sounds ridiculously utopian. Everyone's going to be thinking, wait a minute, what? That never happens. But here are reasons. First of all, there's the humanitarian reason, the fact that, this is the most fundamental human right there is. And so, you got to think that there's going to be some degree of, willingness of governments to just make this happen for that reason. But that's the weakest of the three reasons. We all know perfectly well that doesn't necessarily rank high in government's priorities in terms of decision making. So then the second one is the electoral reason. Poor people have the same number of votes as rich people. How is anybody going to get elected unless they have a manifesto commitment to make sure that taxpayers' money is spent as required to ensure that everybody gets this, irrespective of ability to pay? That's the kind of answer that, that's all I would need to say to anyone in Western Europe, for example, that has socialized medicine, right? In the US, of course, that sounds very curious. That's not the way that we do things over here. But the third answer applies across the board. And it is, to my mind, completely ironclad. It is the economic reason. The fact is, today, when we do not have these therapies, we are spending the vast majority of medical care, medical expenditure on the health problems of late life, right? You know, it's just ridiculous. That's the reason why everyone says, you know, Medicare is going to go bankrupt and everything. Is that like, you know, because so few people die early in life these days, most people get to the point where they get sick as a result of having been born a long time ago. And of course, the problem with those things is that those health problems are chronic and progressive, and they don't kill you very quickly. Especially Alzheimer's is very bad at killing you, and so people live with Alzheimer's for a very long time. So, you know, if one can stop that from happening, from speaking from the point of view of the government, if one can stop that from happening, then one saves the most insane amount of money. In other words, even if initially these therapies are quite expensive to deliver, as you know, most technology is fairly expensive to implement in its first form, right? Even so, you know, it will still pay for itself many times over insanely quickly. In other words, putting it the other way around, it would be economically just completely suicidal for any country not to do this. In other words, for any country to actually allow the market to dictate this and to have these things only available on the basis of ability to pay, such a country would go bankrupt very, very quickly indeed. So the job that I have now is to make sure that governments are fully aware of that completely solid economic logic before they need to act on it. In other words, they're ready when these therapies come along to, you know, to plow in the front loading of investment in infrastructure and training of medical personnel and so on, so as to make sure that the therapies really are available to everybody who's old enough to need them as soon as they possibly can be.
When you explain it like that, it seems like a no-brainer. And something else that came to mind, especially with respect to the US, is the workforce and the amount of money it takes to retire people and rehire people and retrain people. And I can see that being another value proposition to governments and corporations that have big decision-making power. That, hey, like, you're spending X amount of money every year hiring and retraining new people. Like, that goes out the door once therapies like this come to fruition. Am I on the right track here?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, of course, in order to address that question thoroughly and properly, one needs to look not only at the logic around the dissemination of medical care, one also needs to look at automation, the changes to the way the economy is going to work over the coming years as a result of the elimination of the concept of full employment. The fact that, you know, even conservative organizations like the United Nations have been saying for a while now that you know, literally more than half of the jobs that exist in the world will not exist 20 years from now. You know, I think that's quite conservative. And you know, we don't know what's going to happen at the moment. You know, obviously people have got these very crude, preliminary, blunt instrument ideas like universal basic income. There's going to have to be a great deal of refinement and elaboration of that kind of concept in order to create a society in which the reasonably equitable distribution of wealth is, you know, it is implemented in a manner that does not involve people being paid to do stuff they wouldn't do if they were not being paid.
What do you think that work, just to expand upon that a bit, what do you think that world looks like? Because from all the articles I read and the podcasts I listen to, eventually, as you said, most of the daily tasks that we look around and see today are going to be taken over by robots or AI and automation, and people are going to be left without jobs, or jobs as we recognize them today. Some new jobs will come to life, and those will be taken. But for the most part, you're right. There's going to be a surplus of people who are unemployed. What does that world look like to you? Do you think that it's going to be incredibly uneven, or do you think there'll be, you know, people in power will implement will implement things to allow folks to, you know, live peacefully and kind of this utopian vision?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first part of answering that question is to ask how far in advance of this transition people who make these decisions will understand that the transition really is coming. See, at the moment, there's a very strong tendency to hide one's head in the sand on it and to look back at the Industrial Revolution and say, well, okay, it didn't happen then, did it? You know, we had full employment after the Industrial Revolution as well, because all the jobs that went away in manufacturing and agriculture and so on were replaced by this whole magic new thing called the service sector, right? And so, you know, everything was fine, and surely that's going to happen again. The thing is, it's not going to happen again because, you know, when all you've got is like the entertainment, I mean, how many people do you need in the entertainment industry? Not really very many, right? So it really isn't going to happen again. And people need to face up to that first in order to start getting creative about how to come up with good answers to the main question you just asked. Now, I'm not an economist, of course. I'm certainly not a sociologist or anything like that. So I definitely don't pretend to have the best answers to these questions. But I do think that there is no inherent built-in requirement for people to obtain their self-worth in the form of a paycheck. I think that we could look at it, insofar as we can look at aspects of this that exist today, we can say, well, there are certain ultra basic things like, you know, clean running water, which are viewed as fundamentally such a human right, and they're so inexpensive to provide that we basically make sure that everybody's got them, even if they've got exactly zero ability to pay, right? And some of the things that we do that for are actually not so inexpensive to provide, but we see them as good investments. The best one, I think, is basic education. That you know, we give everybody a basic. I mean, it's much too basic, that's for sure, but it's more than nothing, and we give it to absolutely everybody, even in countries like the USA that like to you know, that do things on the basis of ability to pay most of the time. Why do we do that? Fundamentally, it's a good investment. We know that if we don't do that, then, you know, 20 years down the road, we're not going to have a workforce. So I believe if that kind of logic is going to underpin how we make this transition to a more automated world in which the things that people actually spend their time doing are not the same things that are not things that need to be done by somebody, because they no longer do need to be done by any actual living human being. I can envisage a world in which a much higher proportion of the, let's call it the social transaction, the social contract between people that gives people their motivation to do a particular thing with their time, comes from people that they actually physically interact with. You know, that they actually have a direct interaction with, rather than a customer who's 10 steps away.
Yeah, I guess the vision I have is that human beings will have a lot more time to do human things. And I mean, I'm okay as long as the world functions and things work. I'm okay with that vision. I think that human beings, generally speaking, especially here in the US, and I'm kind of not going on too big of a tangent, but somewhat a tangent, like we don't spend nearly as much time doing human things as we should. So I'm for a world like that.
Yeah, I like that phrase, human things. I think I'll adopt that one. Thank you.
Cheers. I'm going to get a bit outside of the box here and kind of go back to the vision that eventually the disease of aging will be cured and human beings will be able to live indefinitely. The Earth's lifespan is not indefinite. And hypothetically speaking, does that mean that we would have to reach a point where we're a multi-planet species and we're venturing off into the universe and into the cosmos and trying to find other planets that are in that Goldilocks zone to inhabitate? I'd love to hear your kind of your thoughts about that.
So yeah, I generally feel that it is an absolute and complete waste of time to think about the distant future, even like 50 years into the future, because of the enormous scope of things that we cannot conceivably anticipate. how they will develop. We don't know what types of technology will actually emerge over that period, and we don't know which of those things are going to matter. So I think all we can do with the distant future is to focus on the most absolutely fundamental things about what it is to be a human being that we can be confident will genuinely not change. So I don't mean like we're probably still going to enjoy having sex. I mean, I kind of do mean that. That's probably number 2 on my list. Number 1 on my list is I'm absolutely certain that in general we are never going to want to get sick. We are going to want to be healthy and youthful, and that means that investing our time now in developing technologies that will allow us to be more youthful in the future than we otherwise would be is, pretty good use of our time. But regarding anything else, I think it's all, I mean, even today, education has moved to a point where we don't so much educate people by teaching them facts, we educate kids by teaching them how to learn, because that's what we have to do, because the facts that we have today are just not going to be very relevant to them, even early in their professional careers. So when I think about the distant future, I think the only real thing we can look at is we can ask questions like, what aspects of how the world, how our environment is likely to change are going to happen in what order. So you talked about like the planet will have a finite lifespan. I think you were basically meaning like, the sun's going to engulf the Earth in 4 billion years or something like that. Was that what you were referring to?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so to me, what matters rather more importantly is that in 4 billion years, over the next 4 billion years, there's a rather high probability that a star that's sufficiently close to us will go supernova and and fry us, right, with cosmic rays or whatever, rather than our own sun doing us any harm. But then the question is, what can we do about that? And I think it's entirely racing certainty that within the next 10,000 years, we will be able to develop technology that will go and defuse stars that are getting close to becoming supernovas. It's that kind of thing that we'll be doing, like the next generation version of asteroid detection.
Fair enough. Aubrey, I wanted to hear a bit more about your foundation. I know you work with a number of foundations, but the one that you're currently with and the work that you guys are doing, we'd love some more insight on that.
Sure. So first of all, the website, levf.org, Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation.org. So everything I don't have time to say today is there, of course. And you can contact us there. You can also contact me on Twitter and elsewhere. So, but what we do, we're a 501c3, and we are focused on doing stuff that is really valuable and that is a little too edgy for other people. One thing that can definitely be said is that people do not give money to Aubrey de Grey if they want their money to be spent in a manner that is timid. So yeah, I do tricky stuff. And so we've talked about most of what LEV Foundation does. I mentioned that we support an organization called the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, which is a lobbying organization that's very active these days on Capitol Hill. We also support another very important advocacy outfit that's just been created. It's called the Healthspan Action Coalition, healthspanaction.org. And they are focused on the older generation, especially as their main audience. Essentially, you can think that their audience is more or less the same as that of the AARP. And in a way, I regard them as the antidote to the AARP, in the sense that when we look at the question of the medical potential to address aging, the AARP doesn't really, it's just at the fatalist level. It's just basically, trying to make the lives of the elderly less miserable, but they kind of run away very fast when you talk about doing anything about aging. So the Healthspan Action Coalition is kind of the antidote to that. But on the research side, so I mentioned we support Kynice, which is, in my view, the company doing the most important, by far the most promising research to improve the quality of cryopreservation and thereby make cryonics really, really work. And we also support another organization relating to cryonics that's looking at essentially rejuvenating tissues very powerfully before cryopreserving them. But our main thing, our flagship project, without a doubt, is our race towards robust mouse rejuvenation. So this is a very large-scale combinatorial rejuvenation program on mice, which we are performing at Ichor Therapeutics, ICHOR. That's one of the spinouts from Sense Research Foundation. It's the most successful spinout out of half a dozen that we created, and they do a bunch of things, but a lot of their work consists of being a CRO and a contract research organization, and in that capacity, they're doing this work for us. So about 3 weeks ago, I bought 1,000 mice, and we will be starting the experiment in about 2 weeks. It will involve the administration of 4 different treatments in various combinations, treatments that address various aspects of aging. We'll be starting the work when the mice are already in middle age, which means that it'll be of personal relevance to people watching. And we shall be monitoring not only, of course, how long they live, but also various aspects of how healthy they are. Some of those are non-invasive, just visual or blood draw kind of thing. Some of them involve killing some of the mice, but not enough to make it impossible for us to know how the lifespan is affected. It's an extreme. It's honestly, it's by far the most exciting project that I've ever led. It's massive, and I'm buzzing. And the thing is, though, it does cost a lot. It's taking most of our budget. This project costs $3 million, and it's not just a one-off. We anticipate that we will be doing successive rounds of experiments like this with another 1,000 mice, given a different bunch of different combination of therapies, and we'll carry on doing this until we get to this point that I've called robust mouse rejuvenation. So in numbers, what that means is we take mice at 18 months, as I mentioned. These are mice which are a nice, healthy, long-lived strain, so they would normally live another year or so from that point to a total of 2.5 years. And we want to double that. We want to take these mice out to 3.5 years average. We also want to make sure that the maximum lifespan, which is normally maybe 6 or 9 months longer than the mean lifespan, is also extended by an additional year. So it's a very ambitious goal, and we're going to get there eventually. And yeah, of course we are. I mean, as I've mentioned, we are a non-profit, and therefore I always have to be out there beating the bushes and saying, like, how we're going to spend our money. This is the main place where money donated to LEV Foundation will be going. We have probably half the money that we currently need in order to kick off round 2, and we'll be ready in every other way to kick off round 2 by Q3, Q4 of this year. So I am working very hard to make sure that we have the full $3 million that we're going to need to kick off round 2 as soon as we can.
Well, that's very exciting, and I can hear it in your voice when you speak about it. I would love to know, and I'm sure a lot of young scientists would love to know, what are some ways that people maybe coming out of university or coming out of PhD programs can work under you, can come and contribute hands-on to what you guys are doing, your initiative?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the advantages that I have, the privileges I have from having been at the forefront of this community for such a long time, is that I have a huge network, which means that it's not just about working under me. People come to me all the time saying, what can I do? And that includes people of all walks of life, with all different kinds of histories. And certainly young scientists is one big subset of that. So when people come to me, obviously my first thing will be I'll ask them a whole bunch of questions about what they're good at, what they like to do, and so on, whether they have any other constraints like geography or whatever. And then I will come to a conclusion of who I should introduce them to, usually. We ourselves are very lean and mean at the LEV Foundation. We basically have hardly any staff, and that's very much by design. But that does not in any way prevent me from giving people of that nature who would come to me pointing them in good directions, giving warm introductions to, senior scientists who are friends of mine, and helping them to make the best contribution they can to this mission.
Aubrey, I sometimes let audience members up, and in this case, I kind of wanted to keep it one-on-one, but I'm going to take some audience questions that are messaging me.
I know. I said you could have as long as you liked, but that was an hour ago, and I do have to quit in 10 minutes. So, but let's use those 10 minutes as well as we can.
Okay, perfect. 10 minutes is plenty of time. So one audience member they're wondering, their sister is partly sighted, and there's something about Elon's plan with curing blindness or stem cells helping. Is blindness is either partly or fully something that can be cured sometime using any of the therapies that we've discussed in the near future?
All right. So the eye is a really complicated organ. There's lots of ways in which you can be blind. In other words, lots of things that can go wrong with the eye. And I'm not really sure that Elon had anything to do with this, but David Sinclair published a paper a year or so ago. Well, actually, I think it only came out very recently, but it was publicized a long time ago. In which there was a very substantial effect on one particular type of blindness in mice from a technique that he was able to use. We also have worked on blindness in various other ways, and indeed that same company, Icor, that I mentioned, where we're doing our mouse work, that company began focused on macular degeneration, which is the #1 cause of blindness in the elderly. And the work that they did there, which was spun out from work at Sense Research Foundation, is now sufficiently successful that it's being sold to Big Pharma, as I understand. So that's very nice, but it still means it's a little way away from the clinic. However, other people have been doing other work in this area, and it's not just macular degeneration. The same is true of glaucoma. The same is true of cataracts. All of these things, there's great progress being made, but I basically can't answer the person's question without knowing a lot more about what kind of problem we're talking about.
That's fair enough. And I think the Elon comment had to do with how he wanted to use Neuralink to cure blindness through AI and electrodes connecting to the brain. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's kind of more of a sidestepping of blindness than curing it.
Understood. So next question. Do you think that as more and more people are able to extend their lifespans and potentially live indefinitely, that the world will become less religious as a result?
Well, it's honestly impossible to say. I mean, you could have said the world would become completely non-religious. Yeah. Well, okay, let's talk about religious per se first. So one could have predicted that, if people no longer believed that the entire panoply of species was created, one by one by some higher being, then and in fact one discovered that they all came into existence spontaneously through emergent complexity, then people would say, oh well, religion's obviously wrong then. But when Darwin came along, that didn't happen. Religion survived perfectly well. So I I think honestly, it's I think if we do go more general and we say spirituality in general, then again, we just can't know. In fact, one could almost argue that the spirituality could increase as a result of wonder at how human beings are so capable of manipulating our environment. I can see that going both ways.
Yeah, when you put it like that, I'd have to concur. And the next question is I'll just ask it. So do you believe there is life on other planets outside of our own?
So this is a really tricky one, but yeah, I mean, I think it is pretty difficult to construct a realistic scenario in which there really is no other life in the universe other than us. Other than what we see on planet Earth. The more we learn about how normal the solar system is, how likely it is that how large a proportion of other stars are likely to have solar systems looking pretty much like ours, with planets that are pretty Earth-like at the right distance from their suns and all that. It becomes really very difficult to believe that none of those planets has undergone the same kind of emergence of complexity that ours has. One can always say, well, okay, some planet has to be first, but we have absolutely no reason to believe that absolutely everything went so like clockwork in the development of life on Earth that there's no way that other planets could have happened first. We certainly know that there are plenty of suns out there that became suns with their solar systems, at least 500 million years before ours did. So, yeah, I think it's basically, it's pretty much inconceivable that we are genuinely alone here.
Fair enough. Yeah, I again agree on that as well. So, for folks that are just going in here, let me actually read this right. So, this person's wondering what they sorry, this is long. So the general question is, what do you think are desirable majors or subjects to study in university that would help people benefit humanity?
Yeah, I can answer. Well, I mean, for benefit of humanity in general, that's too general for me. To get it to benefit the longevity crusade, I can certainly answer that. The thing I always tell people choosing their undergrad courses is don't generalize too much. Do a general biology degree. The reason I say this is that aging affects biology at every level of organization. In order to understand aging pretty well enough to have a good chance of making a contribution, you've really got to be a pretty competent geneticist and physiologist and molecular biologist and cell biologist and biochemist. You've got to really be on top of all of those things to at least an undergrad level. So to do an undergrad degree in a specialization like biochemistry, for example, would be a very bad move. You want to do a general undergrad degree.
Next question, and I don't know, I'll wrap things up here soon. How much do exercise, diet, and lifestyle impact the longevity of someone that is supposed to, I don't understand. So how much do those things affect the longevity of someone who is supposed to, let's say, live like 80 years? This is like a long paragraph. I'm trying to paraphrase.
They'll live. Not much, to be honest. Some people more than others, of course. But yeah, I mean, in general, the people who will benefit the most from exercise and diet and lifestyle are people who have a below average life expectancy by default. And of course, you can give yourself a below average life expectancy by having a really poor diet, for example, or by letting yourself get seriously overweight. But basically, if you're an average person in terms of your genetics and so on, and if you live the way your mother told you to, and you just eat reasonably, and you have enough exercise that you don't get overweight, and so on, then you're doing more or less all you can do right now.
That's fair enough. Aubrey, I'm gonna wrap things up here, but first of all, thank you so much for coming on. This is a much different topic than we're used to having on this podcast, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. We've learned a lot. I've learned a lot, and I would love to have you on for future broadcasts in the future, especially when major breakthroughs are made, or if you want to give an update on what's going on with your foundation. We'd love to have you back on. So.
Well, first of all, let me reciprocally say thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure. I've really enjoyed these 2 hours, and I'd be very delighted to come back anytime. I want to also say, since evidently you had quite a lot of questions come in that you haven't been able to get to, you're totally welcome to just forward them to me. in a manner that I can obviously reply to in some way, or you can give anyone my email address. I do not keep my email address quiet. Aubrey at levf.org. Anyone can write to me there. You can also find me on Twitter at Aubrey de Grey, and I answer things there every day. So, anyone who wants to get in touch, I have found that it's extremely effective to be a man of the people in my style, so to speak, and I also enjoy it very much.
So, final question, Aubrey, and we've enjoyed you very much. But final question, if you could leave our audience with one nugget of wisdom or a few nuggets of wisdom before your way out, what would you say?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, really, the main thing is to focus on evidence in forming one's opinions. So we started out talking a bit about the pro-aging trance, about how people have this mindset, this really fixated mindset that aging is like gravity, and it's like, completely absurd to think about it as a medical problem. One has to actually revisit one's preconceptions in this regard and ask oneself, okay, in what sense can one actually justify such a stance? And of course, then that also applies to all of the crazy reasons why people say that aging is, even if it is a medical problem, it's a blessing in disguise that we don't know how to fix it. Again, that's completely crazy, and it's like one has to actually look oneself in the mirror a bit in order to understand those things. I think that's the main thing.
Right on. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was Aubrey de Grey. Aubrey, again, thank you so much for coming on, and look forward to future broadcasts. Best of luck to you, sir.
Thanks.